Magnus the Red is one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. His story is one of immense power, tragic choices, and a series of events that ultimately set in motion some of the most significant conflicts in the galaxy. To ask if Magnus did anything wrong is to delve into the heart of the Imperium's history, the fate of the Astartes, and the very fabric of the warp itself. The conflict surrounding Magnus is rooted in his pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of an understanding that was both a gift and a curse. As a primarch, Magnus was unmatched in his psychic prowess, but this very power became the source of his undoing. Yet, like many figures in the Warhammer universe, Magnus's actions cannot be fully understood in isolation. His choices were influenced by the greater struggles of the galaxy, the ambitions of the Emperor, and the whispering promises of the Chaos Gods. The question of whether Magnus's actions were wrong is not as simple as black and white. It forces us to confront the deeper issues of fate, destiny, and the consequences of power. Magnus's decisions were shaped by his own ideals and visions for the future, but also by the fractured relationships within the Imperium, his bond with his brothers, and the corrupting influence of chaos. This story is one of ambition, betrayal, and cosmic forces far beyond the control of any one being. In exploring the idea of whether Magnus did anything wrong, we will not just examine his actions, but the broader consequences of his existence. The ripple effects of his choices still shape the future of the Imperium, and perhaps the fate of all humanity. In the story of Magnus and his actions, several key figures and factions play pivotal roles, each with their own motivations, goals, and influence on the outcome of the events. These individuals and groups not only shape Magnus's destiny, but also determine the fate of the Imperium and the galaxy at large. Their involvement is crucial to understanding whether Magnus was right or wrong, and how the web of decisions made by all these players intertwine to create a legacy marked by tragedy, betrayal, and cosmic consequence. The Emperor of Mankind stands at the forefront of this narrative, a figure whose ambitions for humanity set the stage for the conflict. His vision for a united human race, free from the shackles of superstition and chaos, was the driving force behind the Great Crusade. The Emperor sought to guide humanity through reason and order, rejecting the mystical elements of the universe in favor of rationalism and scientific progress. His relationship with Magnus was initially one of admiration, as both shared an understanding of the potential for human growth and evolution. However, the Emperor's refusal to embrace Magnus's psychic powers and his growing distrust of the warp eventually became a source of tension. The Emperor's expectations for his sons, his refusal to accept Magnus's methods, and his decision to ultimately distance himself from Magnus's actions were crucial in driving Magnus down the path he eventually walked. Magnus's brothers, the other members of the Legion, also play an essential role in this drama. While many of them may not have been directly involved in Magnus's decisions, their relationships with him, their personalities, and their actions had a profound impact on the choices Magnus made. The rivalry with some of his brothers, particularly those who disagreed with his psychic abilities, added another layer of complexity to his situation. Their differing views on the role of psychic powers, the warp, and the future of humanity were central to the growing divide within the Imperium, one that ultimately contributed to the breaking of the Great Crusade. Their actions, whether driven by jealousy, duty, or fear, influenced the trajectory of events and magnified the tensions that would lead to the fall of Magnus and his Legion. The Thousand Sons Legion, Magnus's own warriors, are another key faction in this narrative. They were bound by loyalty to their leader, and their belief in the pursuit of knowledge through psychic means often set them apart from the rest of the Imperium. Their role in the story is twofold. On one hand, they represent the idea of a brotherhood forged in the crucible of war and suffering, loyal to Magnus despite the controversy surrounding his methods. On the other hand, their reliance on psychic powers and their eventual descent into the warp made them a dangerous force, one that was perceived as a threat by those who feared the power of the warp. The Thousand Sons, especially in the early stages, were bound by a sense of loyalty to Magnus and the ideals he represented. But as events unfolded, they became key players in the tragic unraveling of the Imperium's unity. The forces of chaos, and particularly the Chaos Gods, played a more indirect but equally critical role in the events surrounding Magnus. The Chaos Gods, ever-present and manipulative, saw in Magnus a tool to further their own agendas. The promises they whispered to him, the allure of power and knowledge that they offered, became a crucial factor in his eventual downfall. Whether Magnus sought their influence intentionally, or whether it was thrust upon him by the warp's nature, is a matter of debate. Nonetheless, the involvement of the Chaos Gods in the narrative of Magnus's fall cannot be overstated. Their manipulations and promises of power acted as a catalyst for Magnus's actions, pushing him to make decisions that would forever alter the course of history. They represented not just an external influence, but also the internal struggle within Magnus, a conflict between his own ideals and the temptations of the warp. The Inquisition, though often a behind-the-scenes force during the early days of the Imperium, would later become one of the most significant factions involved in the aftermath of Magnus's actions. Their role was not just in hunting down perceived threats to the Imperium, but also in maintaining the strict control over psychic powers that the Emperor had sought. The Inquisition's obsession with keeping the warp in check and their willingness to purge any forces that threatened the Imperium's stability led to the eventual criminalization of Magnus's practices. They became a force for condemnation, and their influence would be felt long after Magnus's fall. Their actions would shape the Imperium's response to the chaos unleashed by Magnus, making them a pivotal player in the eventual collapse of the Emperor's vision. The Space Wolves, a force loyal to the Emperor, are another crucial faction in the events surrounding Magnus's fall. Their role is often seen as one of antagonism towards Magnus and his legion. Their hatred for Magnus and the Thousand Sons, fueled by the events of Prospero, would solidify their place as one of the most vocal opponents of Magnus's rise to power. The Space Wolves, under their chapter master, played a direct role in the conflict that led to Magnus's exile, and their actions were instrumental in turning the Emperor against his son. Their deeply ingrained distrust of psychic powers and their hatred for Magnus's methods only deepened the rift between them, making their role in the tragic events that followed all the more significant. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguards, while not directly involved in the conflict between Magnus and the Imperium, played an important part in the greater unfolding drama. Their loyalty to the Emperor and their role in defending the Imperial Palace meant that they were always a silent yet powerful force in the background of the events. Their presence at key moments, such as during Magnus's ultimate confrontation with the Emperor, highlighted the divide between the Emperor's intentions and the forces that Magnus sought to protect. The Custodes, though not directly engaging with Magnus's actions, represented the Emperor's authority and the ideals he sought to impose upon his sons and the Imperium. Their role is more symbolic but crucial in understanding the larger forces at play. Finally, the psychic community, a group of individuals, scholars, and mystics who sought to understand and control the warp, also plays a significant role. These figures, though not always directly aligned with Magnus, were part of the larger context of psychic power in the Imperium. Their views on the use of psychic powers, their understanding of the warp, and their opposition to the Emperor's increasingly rigid stance on the matter influenced the course of Magnus's life. They represented a larger philosophical divide within the Imperium regarding the nature of psychic abilities and the future of humanity in a galaxy filled with unknown and dangerous forces. The roles of these factions and individuals are inextricably linked to the larger narrative of Magnus's actions and the question of whether he did anything wrong. Their involvement shaped the environment in which Magnus made his choices, and their reactions to his decisions continue to echo throughout the history of the Imperium. Understanding their roles is essential in unpacking the complexity of Magnus's fall and the consequences of his actions, as well as in determining whether his decisions were, in fact, wrong or simply a product of a broken and divided galaxy. The events that led to the ultimate conflict surrounding Magnus were not simply the result of one single act or decision, but rather a culmination of a series of actions, ideologies, and tensions that built up over time. In the broadest sense, the situation emerged from the inherent conflict between two opposing philosophies, each of which sought to guide humanity down different paths. These opposing views, which began as subtle ideological differences, ultimately turned into a deep rift, with consequences that reached far beyond the immediate actions of any one individual. At the heart of the conflict was the growing tension between the Emperor's vision for the future of mankind and the increasingly complex role of psychic powers within the galaxy. The Emperor's vision was one of unity under the banner of rationality, scientific progress, and the rejection of chaos and superstition. He sought to create a society built on logic and order, free from the influences of the warp, and a humanity that would evolve into something greater, free from the shackles of fear and the supernatural. The Emperor saw the warp not as a source of power, but as a dangerous and corrupting force that should be avoided at all costs. For Magnus, however, this vision was deeply flawed. Magnus had long believed in the potential of psychic powers to enhance humanity's abilities and understanding of the universe. He viewed the warp not only as a powerful tool, but as a necessary aspect of the universe, one that could be harnessed to unlock new realms of knowledge. To Magnus, the Emperor's rejection of psychic abilities seemed not only short-sighted, but also dangerously naive. As the Great Crusade progressed, the gap between their philosophies widened, setting the stage for the events that would ultimately lead to the confrontation between them. This conflict was exacerbated by the nature of Magnus's powers. His psychic abilities were not just an aspect of his being. They were central to his identity and his vision of the future. He saw the warp as an integral part of the universe that could be explored and mastered rather than something to be feared. This belief put him at odds with the Emperor, who increasingly viewed psychic powers as a threat that could undermine the unity of humanity and lead to corruption. The Emperor's growing disdain for psychic abilities was further compounded by his distrust of the otherworldly forces within the warp, particularly as his awareness of the Chaos Gods deepened. The Emperor's decision to impose stricter controls over the use of psychic powers within the Imperium, and his increasing unwillingness to entertain any form of negotiation with those who disagreed, created a growing rift between the two sides. The Emperor's mistrust of the warp, coupled with his desire to impose strict order on the galaxy, led to the creation of increasingly harsh policies that sought to suppress the use of psychic abilities, even within his own ranks. For Magnus and those who shared his views, these policies were seen as a betrayal of the potential for greater human achievement. Magnus believed that the Emperor's refusal to accept the warp as a legitimate source of power was not only a rejection of his own beliefs, but a dangerous denial of reality. This ideological clash reached its peak when Magnus, in his quest for knowledge and understanding, discovered the depths of the forces that lay beyond the material universe. The more Magnus delved into the warp, the more he became entangled in its mysteries. He saw the power of the warp as a necessary tool for the survival and advancement of humanity, believing that the Emperor's refusal to acknowledge it was a grave mistake. Magnus's obsession with understanding the warp grew, and he began to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable within the Imperium. At the same time, the Emperor's concerns about the dangers of the warp intensified. His efforts to control or eliminate the use of psychic powers within the Imperium, as well as his growing distrust of those who embraced the warp, became more stringent. The Emperor's belief that psychic powers could lead to humanity's downfall, especially if left unchecked, began to take a more authoritarian form. His decision to establish the Inquisition and the secret police force that would eventually come to control psychic activity in the Imperium further alienated those like Magnus, who believed in the necessity of the warp for the future of mankind. As the tensions between these two philosophies grew, so too did the distance between the Emperor and Magnus. The Emperor's increasingly dictatorial approach to the management of psychic powers only hardened Magnus's resolve. He saw the Emperor's actions not as an effort to protect humanity, but as a betrayal of the vision they had once shared. For Magnus, the Emperor's actions were not simply a rejection of his own beliefs, but a denial of the very potential of humanity itself. The situation reached a breaking point when Magnus, in a desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of the dangers that lay ahead, made a fateful decision. Magnus, using his vast psychic abilities, attempted to break through the Emperor's defenses and communicate directly with him. He hoped that by demonstrating the full extent of the danger they faced, he could persuade the Emperor to change his course. However, this act, seen as a violation of the Emperor's wishes, was perceived as an act of rebellion and treachery. The Emperor, already distrustful of Magnus's increasingly independent actions, saw this as a final breach of trust. Magnus's decision to intervene directly, to take matters into his own hands, was the catalyst that set the stage for the inevitable clash. What followed was a tragic series of events that would see Magnus's fate sealed. The Emperor's rejection of Magnus was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a reflection of the larger ideological conflict that had been building for years. Magnus's own actions, driven by a desire to protect humanity and further its potential, ultimately led to the fracture of the Imperium. His refusal to comply with the Emperor's wishes, his determination to follow his own path, and his inability to see the Emperor's actions as anything other than a betrayal all played a role in the tragic chain of events that followed. The Emperor's subsequent actions in response to Magnus's rebellion were equally decisive. His decision to send forces to quash Magnus and his legion was a final attempt to impose order on the galaxy and prevent the threat that Magnus represented from spreading. The Emperor's rejection of Magnus was not simply a personal decision, but a broader statement about the future of the Imperium and the role of psychic powers within it. The conflict between them had become a symbol of the larger battle for the soul of humanity, a battle that would have consequences far beyond the immediate actions of any one individual. As the Emperor and Magnus drifted further apart, the stage was set for the ultimate clash between their conflicting visions. What had started as an ideological difference had grown into a bitter, destructive conflict that would reshape the galaxy. The Emperor, with his growing fear of the warp and its influence, sought to stamp out any trace of it, while Magnus, driven by a belief in the warp's potential, could not back down. This fundamental disagreement would not only lead to the fall of Magnus, but would also set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably alter the future of humanity. The chain of events that ultimately led to the conflict involving Magnus unfolded in several key stages, each one building on the actions of the past and contributing to the growing tension between him and the Emperor. These stages did not happen in isolation, but were part of a broader narrative of ideological differences, personal decisions, and ultimately the tragic fall of Magnus. The first major event in this unfolding drama was Magnus's growing belief in the necessity of psychic powers. Early in the Great Crusade, his understanding of the warp and its potential for enhancing humanity was in alignment with the Emperor's vision of uniting the galaxy. However, the Emperor's increasing distance from those who sought to embrace the warp began to make Magnus question the Emperor's true intentions. Magnus, in his efforts to uncover the deeper truths of the universe, became more involved with the powers of the warp. As his knowledge grew, so too did his conviction that the warp was not a force to be feared, but a source of great potential. In the early stages of his actions, Magnus sought to gather knowledge without openly defying the Emperor's authority. He explored the boundaries of psychic powers in secret, pushing the limits of his abilities and seeking answers in ways that the Emperor had not permitted. During this period, Magnus's activities were not yet seen as a direct challenge to the Emperor, but rather as a personal journey of discovery. However, the seeds of conflict had already been planted, as Magnus's growing power and understanding of the warp began to shape his decisions. The tension between Magnus and the Emperor reached a critical point when the Emperor became aware of the extent of Magnus's exploration of the warp. It was no longer a secret. The Emperor's reaction was one of growing alarm. The Emperor's belief in the necessity of suppressing psychic powers and controlling the influence of the warp led him to take increasingly harsh measures. Magnus, in turn, saw these measures as a betrayal of everything they had worked toward together. His response to the Emperor's growing suspicion was to double down on his belief that the warp held the key to humanity's future. As the conflict escalated, Magnus's actions became bolder. He began to openly defy the Emperor's directives, using his powers in ways that directly challenged the Emperor's edicts. His growing frustration with the Emperor's refusal to accept the warp as an essential part of their mission led him to take drastic steps. One such action was the decision to send a powerful psychic warning to the Emperor. In an attempt to warn the Emperor of an impending threat, Magnus used his psychic abilities to contact the Emperor directly, breaking the established boundaries and revealing the full extent of his power. This action, which was meant as a plea for understanding, instead confirmed the Emperor's worst fears about Magnus's growing independence and his willingness to act without approval. The Emperor's reaction to this event was swift and unforgiving. Seeing Magnus's actions as a direct challenge to his authority, the Emperor took drastic steps to sever the relationship between them. Magnus, in turn, became more isolated, feeling that his efforts to warn the Emperor were misunderstood and misinterpreted as acts of rebellion. This marked the point of no return. The Emperor's growing mistrust of Magnus and his refusal to acknowledge the necessity of the warp as a force for good in the universe turned the once unified relationship into one of hostility. As the tension between Magnus and the Emperor reached its peak, the next key stage of events was the decision to intervene in the unfolding situation with the traitors. The Emperor, feeling that the psychic influence in his ranks had become too dangerous to ignore, decided to act decisively. His decision to take action against Magnus was not simply about maintaining control over the use of psychic abilities, but about preventing the rise of a power that he feared could threaten the stability of the Imperium. Magnus, unable to back down from his beliefs, found himself increasingly at odds with the Emperor's vision. The next pivotal moment in the timeline was the catastrophic psychic battle that ensued. Magnus, realizing that his efforts to communicate with the Emperor had failed, began to prepare for the worst. His actions led to an open confrontation with the Emperor's forces. The ensuing conflict, though brief, was decisive in its consequences. The Emperor, unable to contain the threat posed by Magnus and the forces that supported him, ordered an attack on Magnus's position. The Emperor's forces, including the mighty legions at his disposal, engaged in a full-scale assault against Magnus and his followers. The resulting battle was one of immense destruction. Magnus's psychic powers clashed with the Emperor's forces, tearing through the fabric of reality itself. The battle was not only a physical confrontation, but a psychic war of unprecedented scale. The very nature of the warp itself was shaken by the forces unleashed in this conflict. The actions taken by both sides caused ripples that would resonate throughout the galaxy for millennia. Magnus, facing overwhelming opposition, began to retreat. However, in doing so, he made one final, desperate decision that would forever alter his fate. He attempted to summon the full power of the warp, opening a rift that would allow him and his followers to escape. This act, though driven by a need for survival, was also a desperate attempt to preserve the ideals he believed in. The consequence of this action was catastrophic. As Magnus attempted to escape through the rift, he unwittingly drew the attention of the forces of chaos, who would play a crucial role in his future. In the aftermath of this event, Magnus found himself not only rejected by the Emperor, but now also deeply entangled with the powers of chaos. His actions, which had initially been driven by a desire to protect humanity and push the boundaries of knowledge, had now led him into the embrace of forces that he had once sought to avoid. The decisions that Magnus had made, from his early explorations of the warp to his final desperate act to break free, had irrevocably altered the course of his future and that of the galaxy. Magnus's journey, which had begun with the desire to unlock the secrets of the universe, had ultimately led him down a path of betrayal, tragedy, and corruption. His attempts to warn the Emperor, his defiance of authority, and his desperate struggle for survival had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the fate of humanity. The consequences of his actions were not confined to him alone, but would affect the future of the Imperium and the galaxy for generations to come. The conflict between Magnus and the Emperor, and the events that followed, marked a turning point in the history of the galaxy. The ultimate destruction of the relationship between them set the stage for the fracturing of the Imperium, as ideologies that had once united humanity were torn apart. Magnus's actions, while driven by a belief in a greater good, ultimately led him to a tragic end, caught between the forces of chaos and the vision of a broken Imperium. The pivotal event that serves as the focal point of the debate surrounding Magnus's actions is undoubtedly the decision to break the Emperor's command and use psychic powers in defiance of Imperial order. This act, which occurred during a crucial moment of the Great Crusade, became the catalyst for his eventual fall from grace and the heart of the controversy that surrounds his legacy. The Emperor had made it clear that psychic powers, while invaluable for the advancement of human civilization, were also dangerous and must be tightly controlled. He feared the influence of the warp, the realm of the gods, and the potential for corruption that came with wielding such power. He saw the potential for absolute power through psychic abilities, but also the risk of those abilities turning against humanity. To mitigate this risk, he ordered the creation of the Imperial Truth, which prohibited the unregulated use of psychic abilities and banned the worship of any gods or entities that might originate from the warp. This stance was meant to protect humanity from the perilous influence of the gods and the unknown dangers of the warp. Magnus, however, did not see the warp in the same way as the Emperor. He believed that the Emperor's rejection of the warp and psychic powers was short-sighted and ultimately detrimental to humanity's future. To Magnus, the warp was a realm of infinite possibilities, and he saw its use as not only necessary, but also as a means to enhance human evolution and understanding of the universe. The Emperor's refusal to accept this reality created an ideological rift that would define the conflict between them. Magnus, driven by a deep-seated belief that he was on the right path, made the decision to act contrary to the Emperor's will. Despite knowing that the Emperor's stance on psychic powers was clear, Magnus continued to study and use his abilities to delve deeper into the warp, seeing no inherent danger in its exploration. He believed that his actions were for the greater good, that he was unlocking secrets that would benefit humanity, even if those in power did not agree with him. He justified his disobedience by claiming that his understanding of the warp and psychic powers was a tool that would lead to the ultimate success of the Emperor's vision, even if it meant breaking the rules set by the Emperor. The decision that serves as the key turning point in the debate was not simply Magnus's continued use of his psychic powers, but the moment when he took a drastic and irrevocable step in breaking the Emperor's command. In a bid to warn the Emperor of a coming threat, one he believed would change the course of the galaxy, Magnus chose to send a psychic message directly to the Emperor. This message was meant to be a warning, but the method he used to send it was a direct violation of the Emperor's directive. By opening a psychic pathway to communicate with the Emperor, Magnus broke the fundamental rule of the Emperor's laws. He used the warp to try and bridge the gap between himself and the Emperor, unknowingly drawing the attention of forces that the Emperor had worked so hard to keep at bay. This act of breaking the Emperor's command by using psychic communication was a critical juncture in the conflict. Magnus's motives for doing so were rooted in his desire to protect humanity and save the Emperor from the coming threat. However, the Emperor saw this act as an unforgivable betrayal. The use of psychic powers, which the Emperor had specifically outlawed, symbolized everything the Emperor feared: uncontrolled forces, the risk of chaos, and the threat of corruption from the warp. To the Emperor, Magnus's defiance represented not just a disobedience of orders, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the dangers involved. He saw Magnus's actions as reckless, as an act of hubris that placed the Imperium at risk. This moment, the sending of the psychic message, became the flashpoint for the ensuing conflict. It not only led to the Emperor's anger, but also revealed the chasm between the two figures. The Emperor, whose vision was focused on the survival and advancement of humanity, viewed Magnus's actions as a direct challenge to his authority and a threat to the unity of the Imperium. He believed that Magnus's willingness to break his rules and use the warp was a sign that he could no longer be trusted to adhere to the Emperor's vision. For Magnus, however, this decision was not one born out of malice or disobedience. He believed wholeheartedly that the Emperor's rejection of the warp was a mistake, and his desperate attempt to communicate with the Emperor was an act of loyalty. Magnus's motivations were driven by a desire to warn the Emperor about the looming threat that he had sensed. In his eyes, his actions were justified by the greater good of humanity. He believed that the Emperor would ultimately understand, or at the very least, appreciate his foresight and warning. The response to Magnus's act of defiance was swift and decisive. The Emperor, in his anger, saw Magnus's actions as the breaking point. It confirmed his worst fears about the potential dangers of unregulated psychic power, and it deepened his mistrust of Magnus. Rather than listening to the warning or understanding the motivations behind it, the Emperor viewed Magnus's breach of his orders as a signal that Magnus was no longer aligned with the Emperor's vision for the future of humanity. The Emperor, in his anger, chose to act decisively, moving against Magnus and initiating a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the breaking of their bond. Magnus's decision, then, was the critical moment in the larger narrative, one that set in motion the tragic downfall of his relationship with the Emperor and his eventual fall into the influence of chaos. His actions, while based on his belief in the greater good, were seen as an act of betrayal and rebellion. This singular moment of defiance encapsulates the central dilemma at the heart of the debate over Magnus's legacy. Was his decision an error in judgment, or was it a necessary act of foresight that was misunderstood by the Emperor? The answer to this question lies at the heart of the discourse on whether Magnus truly did anything wrong. The aftermath of Magnus's decision to break the Emperor's command had profound and immediate consequences for the galaxy, shaping the trajectory of both the Imperium and the wider conflict in ways that still echo through the universe. His defiance set in motion a chain of events that altered the fate of the Imperium and cast a long shadow over his legacy, raising the central question of whether his actions were truly wrong or merely misunderstood. The most immediate consequence of Magnus's decision was the Emperor's fury. Upon learning of the breach, the Emperor viewed this act as a betrayal of the highest order. The Emperor had spent years building the foundation of the Imperium on a belief in the unity and control of humanity, free from the influence of the warp and the gods. Magnus's actions shattered this vision. The Emperor's response to Magnus's defiance was swift and unyielding. He ordered the attack on Magnus and his forces, marking the beginning of a bitter conflict between them. This betrayal was not merely a personal rift between two powerful figures. It had far-reaching implications. The Emperor's wrath led to the assault on Magnus's forces, resulting in widespread destruction. The decision to unleash the full power of the Imperium's might against Magnus and his followers was catastrophic. The war that followed, known as the Rubric of Ahriman, devastated entire systems and tore apart the fabric of the Imperium. Magnus and his forces, once a part of the Emperor's vision, were now exiled to the Eye of Terror, an uninhabitable region of space controlled by the dark forces of chaos. The impact of Magnus's actions was not limited to the immediate destruction of his forces. The consequences of his breach of imperial law rippled outwards, leaving a mark on the Imperium that would endure for millennia. One of the most significant effects was the fracturing of the Imperium's unity. The Emperor's command was not just an order. It was a symbol of the order and control that he sought to impose on the galaxy. Magnus's defiance was the first crack in this unity, and it set a precedent for the growing influence of chaos. The rupture between the Emperor and Magnus served as a catalyst for the greater chaos conflict that would later come to define the fate of the galaxy. For the Imperium, this event marked the beginning of a long and painful chapter. It revealed the deep fault lines within the Empire, specifically the tension between those who wished to control psychic power and those who sought to harness it. Magnus's actions exposed the underlying mistrust and fear of the warp that the Emperor had instilled within the Imperium, but it also showed the allure of the warp itself. His defiance suggested that psychic power could not be contained or controlled by a single ideology. Instead, it had its own unpredictable nature, one that could lead to both creation and destruction in equal measure. In the wake of Magnus's fall, the warp itself began to take a more prominent role in galactic affairs. Chaos, once a fringe threat, began to assert itself more openly. The breaking of the Emperor's law, combined with Magnus's defection to the forces of chaos, gave rise to the cults of chaos, who were emboldened by the increasing instability within the Imperium. As a result, the Imperium found itself fighting not just against physical enemies, but against the insidious influence of the warp itself. This would lead to the rise of numerous chaos factions, each of which had its own vision for the future of the galaxy. But even within the forces of chaos, the consequences of Magnus's actions were not straightforward. His decision to break from the Emperor and embrace the powers of chaos led him down a path of isolation and internal conflict. Despite his alliance with the forces of the warp, Magnus's motivations were always driven by a desire to protect humanity, albeit in a very different way than the Emperor had envisioned. As a result, he found himself in a strange position, neither fully accepted by the forces of chaos nor completely rejected by them. His actions, while seen as a betrayal, were also a reflection of the complexities of his character. The rubric, the disastrous event that followed Magnus's decision, also had profound consequences for his followers. Those who were loyal to him, both human and mutant alike, were transformed. The rubric turned many of them into soulless husks, severing their connection to the warp and sealing their fates. This process was the ultimate price for disobedience, but it was also the bitter cost of following a leader whose vision was misunderstood and whose ambitions, though noble in their own way, were ultimately flawed. The rubric not only cost Magnus the loyalty of his followers, but also solidified his place as a tragic figure, a leader who sought to protect humanity, but whose methods led to irrevocable destruction. On a broader scale, the effect of Magnus's actions contributed to the larger chaos insurgency. While chaos was not a new force, the increasing number of defections from the Emperor's side, starting with Magnus, signaled a deeper unraveling of the Imperium's strength. His rebellion and the subsequent rise of chaos factions helped to establish the long-lasting war between the Imperium and the forces of the warp, a war that would continue to define the galaxy for millennia. At the core of the debate, then, is whether Magnus's actions were truly evil or whether he was simply a tragic figure who made an ill-fated decision in the pursuit of what he believed to be the greater good. His motivations, while noble in intent, led to catastrophic consequences for both his followers and the galaxy at large. His defiance led to the destruction of his legion, the corruption of his followers, and the fracturing of the Imperium's unity. The war that followed, combined with the subsequent rise of chaos, plunged the galaxy into a state of eternal conflict. In conclusion, Magnus's actions did have a far-reaching and undeniable impact on the galaxy, but whether they were inherently wrong is a matter of perspective. His decision to defy the Emperor was rooted in a belief that he could protect humanity from the very forces that would destroy it. However, the cost of his actions, both to himself and to the galaxy, was enormous. From the standpoint of the Imperium, Magnus's defiance was an unforgivable betrayal, one that led to the ruination of his legion and the fracturing of the Imperium's unity. But from his perspective, his actions were not evil. They were a desperate attempt to safeguard humanity from a much darker fate. One of the most frequently discussed and unique aspects surrounding Magnus's actions, particularly in relation to whether he did anything wrong, is the role of psychic powers within the broader context of the Imperium and the Emperor's vision. The nature of psychic abilities and their place within the galaxy was central to Magnus's actions, as well as the Emperor's response. Magnus's profound connection to the warp and his role as one of the most powerful psychics in the galaxy set him apart from his brothers and created a rift that is still debated to this day. The tension between the Emperor's desire to suppress psychic powers and Magnus's belief in their necessity highlights a fundamental ideological divide that has captivated the Warhammer community. The Emperor, in his vision for a united humanity, sought to eliminate the influence of the warp and psychic manipulation, viewing it as a dangerous and unpredictable force. In contrast, Magnus saw the warp as a tool, albeit a dangerous one, that could be harnessed for the benefit of humanity. This philosophical divide forms the backbone of many debates in the Warhammer community about whether Magnus was justified in his actions or whether he truly made a fatal error. The question of whether Magnus did anything wrong is intrinsically linked to the role of the warp in the universe. The warp, with its volatile and chaotic nature, is a constant source of tension. Magnus's deep understanding of the warp and his quest for knowledge led him to a point where he felt that the Emperor's rejection of the warp was both short-sighted and dangerous. The tragic irony of this situation is that while Magnus's intentions were to protect humanity from the forces of chaos by gaining deeper understanding of the warp, his actions ultimately pushed him closer to the very thing he sought to avoid: corruption by the Chaos Gods. Another unique aspect is the nature of Magnus's fall from grace, which has been a central point of discussion among fans for years. The rubric of Ahriman, the tragic transformation of Magnus's legion, is often highlighted as a defining moment in his story. The rubric, which turned many of his followers into soulless husks, is not just a consequence of Magnus's rebellion, but also a result of the very warp powers he sought to control. Fans often debate whether the rubric was a necessary evil, a tragic accident, or a manifestation of the corrupting influence of chaos itself. This aspect of Magnus's story continues to spark discussions about the line between ambition and hubris, with some seeing Magnus as a visionary who sought to wield dangerous knowledge for the greater good, while others view him as a tragic figure undone by his inability to recognize the danger of the very forces he sought to control. The Emperor's decision to cast Magnus and his followers out of the Imperium and the subsequent pursuit of the traitor was another significant moment that has become the subject of much fan speculation. Fans often engage in debates about whether the Emperor's decision to engage in a full-scale assault on Magnus was the correct response, or whether a more diplomatic approach could have avoided the tragic fallout. Some argue that the Emperor's harsh response was an overreaction, driven by pride and an unwillingness to accept the potential benefits of Magnus's psychic knowledge. Others believe that the Emperor was justified in his actions, as the rebellion posed a direct threat to his vision of the Imperium and the future of humanity. Additionally, the question of Magnus's morality and the extent of his wrongdoing also intersects with the broader theme of the Emperor's own flaws. There is a growing debate within the community about whether the Emperor was truly the infallible, godlike figure he is often portrayed to be. Some fans argue that the Emperor's rigid control over the Imperium, his refusal to accept certain forms of knowledge and power, and his tendency to manipulate others for his own vision led directly to the events that unfolded. From this perspective, Magnus's rebellion is seen not as an individual failing, but as a symptom of a much larger problem within the Imperium, an unwillingness to adapt, to understand the complexities of the warp, and to allow for alternative visions of what humanity could become. In this context, Magnus's actions and the subsequent events can be seen as part of a much larger cosmic struggle for the soul of humanity. The debate among fans often revolves around the idea that Magnus's defiance was not simply a personal betrayal, but rather a reflection of a larger philosophical conflict between freedom and control, knowledge and ignorance, and unity and division. Magnus's decision to act on his own beliefs about the warp was a direct challenge to the Emperor's authoritarian vision of humanity's future, and this conflict has deepened over time, leading to an ongoing war between the forces of chaos and the Imperium. Moreover, one of the most unique aspects of Magnus's story is the ambiguity surrounding his true motivations. Was he driven purely by a desire to protect humanity, or was his pursuit of power and knowledge a deeper, more self-serving quest? This ambiguity is a key aspect of his character, and one that has made him a subject of fascination for fans. Unlike some of the other figures in the Warhammer universe, whose motivations are often clear-cut, Magnus remains an enigmatic figure whose actions defy easy interpretation. His relationship with the Emperor, his role within the galaxy, and his connection to the Warp all contribute to a complex narrative that resists simplistic judgments. The discussion surrounding Magnus's fate also touches upon the theme of redemption. Given that he sought to protect humanity in his own way, is there a path for Magnus to be redeemed? Many fans speculate about the possibility of Magnus regaining his place within the Imperium, or at least finding some form of reconciliation with the Emperor. However, this potential redemption is complicated by the nature of the Warp and the fact that Magnus has become irrevocably tied to the forces of chaos. This ongoing tension between redemption and corruption is one of the defining aspects of Magnus's character, and it is one that continues to provoke passionate debate among fans. In conclusion, the unique aspects of Magnus's story revolve around the complex relationship between knowledge, power, and morality. His actions and the fallout from those actions have sparked discussions about the role of psychic powers, the conflict between the Emperor's vision and Magnus's beliefs, and the broader philosophical implications of his rebellion. Fans continue to debate whether Magnus was truly wrong, or whether he was a tragic figure caught in the midst of a much larger, cosmic struggle. These questions will likely persist as long as there are fans who continue to explore the depths of Magnus's story and the broader narrative of the Warhammer universe. Magnus the Red, often seen as a tragic figure within the lore, is one of the most complex personalities in the Warhammer universe. He's characterized by a profound sense of ambition and vision, coupled with a deep desire for knowledge. Magnus's strength lies in his intellect and his unparalleled connection to the Warp. He sought to harness the powers of the Warp not for personal gain, but to protect humanity from the forces of chaos. His knowledge, however, proved to be both a gift and a curse, as it led him to a path of rebellion and eventual fall from grace. His ability to perceive the future and understand the deeper workings of the universe made him an invaluable asset to the Emperor, but it also made him a target for manipulation and misunderstanding. Magnus was a visionary, but his obsession with knowledge led him to question the very structure and authority of the Imperium, setting him on a collision course with the Emperor himself. Yet, Magnus's greatest strength, his intellectual capabilities, was also his most significant weakness. His obsession with knowledge often blinded him to the consequences of his actions. He saw himself as the protector of humanity, believing that his vast understanding of the Warp could prevent humanity's destruction. However, his hubris led him to dismiss the warnings of others, including the Emperor, and to make decisions that would have disastrous consequences. Magnus's downfall was driven by his inability to understand the dangers of the Warp fully, and the Emperor's refusal to embrace its potential. His tragic flaw was that he couldn't see the consequences of his actions until it was too late, and even then, he remained steadfast in his belief that his actions were justified. On the other side of this conflict stands the Emperor of Mankind, a figure of unmatched power and vision. While his goals for humanity were grand and ultimately aimed at ensuring the survival and advancement of the species, the Emperor's methods were often inflexible and harsh. His belief in the necessity of controlling and suppressing the Warp was central to his vision for the Imperium, and he saw Magnus's use of psychic powers as a direct threat to that vision. The Emperor, while often seen as a godlike figure, was not without flaws. His insistence on unity and control, coupled with his distrust of the Warp, led him to make decisions that many would argue were short-sighted and ultimately damaging to the Imperium. While Magnus sought to protect humanity through knowledge and understanding, the Emperor believed that such power was too dangerous and that the only way to safeguard the Imperium was through strict control and suppression. The Emperor's greatest strength, his unwavering focus on the survival of humanity, was also his greatest weakness. His refusal to adapt, to consider alternative paths to power, and his reliance on suppression rather than understanding created the conditions for Magnus's rebellion. Despite his immense wisdom and power, the Emperor's inability to compromise or see beyond his rigid vision led to the fracturing of his empire. The Emperor's harshness toward Magnus and his refusal to acknowledge the potential benefits of Magnus's psychic knowledge ultimately led to the downfall of his grand vision. A prominent figure in this tragic conflict is Lorgar, a once loyal son who later became one of the most vocal proponents of chaos. Lorgar was deeply religious and believed that the Emperor should be worshipped as a god. His unwavering faith in the Emperor's divinity and his subsequent rejection by the Emperor led him down a path of bitterness and resentment. Lorgar's journey is one of the most tragic in the Warhammer universe, as he was ultimately betrayed by the very figure he sought to elevate. Lorgar's strengths lay in his unshakable faith and his ability to inspire loyalty in those around him, but his weaknesses were equally apparent. His inability to see the world beyond his religious convictions and his obsession with the idea of divinity blinded him to the truth of the Emperor's vision. Lorgar's fall into chaos was a direct result of the Emperor's rejection of his faith and his insistence on suppressing the worship of the divine. However, Lorgar's flaws as a leader were apparent even before his fall. His inability to compromise, his rigid adherence to his faith, and his failure to adapt to the changing circumstances of the galaxy led him down a path that would ultimately lead to the destruction of his ideals. Lorgar's story is one of loss and betrayal, but it also highlights the dangers of unchecked faith and the inability to see beyond one's own narrow worldview. Another figure central to the debate on Magnus's actions is Ahriman, one of Magnus's most trusted lieutenants. Ahriman was an extraordinarily gifted psychic who sought to preserve the integrity of his legion and the people he cared for. His primary goal was to undo the damage caused by the rubric, a devastating event that turned many of their warriors into mindless husks. Ahriman's journey is one of redemption, as he sought to correct the mistakes made by Magnus and to find a way to protect his brothers and sisters from the corruption of chaos. While Ahriman's actions were often seen as necessary to preserve the integrity of his legion, his decisions were also filled with moral ambiguity. Ahriman's ultimate fate, like Magnus's, is a tragic one, and his constant struggle to undo the damage caused by the rubric and his loyalty to his brothers make him one of the most complex figures in the Warhammer universe. Ahriman's greatest strength was his unwavering commitment to his beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. His goal was always to preserve the lives of those he cared about, but his inability to find a solution to the curse of the rubric led him down a path of desperation. His use of forbidden magic to find a cure for the rubric ultimately led him to a path of no return, and his transformation into a figure of chaos highlights the dangerous nature of the warp and the cost of seeking power beyond one's control. Like Magnus, Ahriman's flaws were not inherent malice, but rather a deep sense of responsibility that led him to make decisions that ultimately resulted in tragedy. The final significant figure in this narrative is Horus, the War Master and one of the Emperor's most trusted sons, who became the leader of the traitor forces. While Horus's story is often told as one of betrayal and corruption, it is also a tale of manipulation and hubris. Horus was an exceptional leader, charismatic and capable of inspiring loyalty in his followers. However, his ultimate fall into chaos was not solely his fault. He was manipulated by the forces of chaos, and his decisions were influenced by powers beyond his control. Horus's role in Magnus's rebellion is more indirect, but his actions were crucial to the larger conflict that ensued. His betrayal of the Emperor and his role in the Horus heresy changed the course of history, leading to the fragmentation of the Imperium and the rise of chaos. In conclusion, the personalities involved in Magnus's story are all deeply complex, with strengths and flaws that drive the tragic events of the Warhammer universe. Magnus, the Emperor, Lorgar, Ahriman, and Horus all played crucial roles in the events that unfolded, each bringing their own unique perspective to the table. Their actions, motivations, and ultimate fates reflect the complexities of the Warhammer universe, where even the noblest of intentions can lead to destruction, and where every choice carries profound consequences. The question of whether Magnus did anything wrong is deeply debated within the Warhammer 40k community, with many unresolved issues, interpretations, and theories surrounding his actions. His motivations and decisions have sparked ongoing discussions among fans, offering a variety of perspectives on his character and his role in the broader conflict of the galaxy. One of the most prominent unresolved questions is the extent of Magnus's culpability in the events leading to the Horus heresy. Did he genuinely believe he was acting in the best interests of humanity, or did his actions stem from arrogance and a desire to pursue forbidden knowledge? His intent to save humanity from the dangers of chaos and the warp is often presented as noble, yet his decisions, particularly the use of sorcery and his eventual alliance with forces of chaos, have led many to question whether he overstepped boundaries that should not have been crossed. Was his belief that the Emperor's vision was flawed a sign of hubris, or was he truly a prophet who saw the future and tried to prevent disaster? This has led to the theory that Magnus was ahead of his time, attempting to do what the Emperor could not. But this comes with the inevitable question: could he have achieved his goals without the corruption of chaos? Another key point of discussion revolves around the Emperor's role in Magnus's downfall. Some argue that Magnus's fall could have been prevented if the Emperor had shown more flexibility or understood Magnus's intentions better. The Emperor's refusal to acknowledge the use of the warp as a potential tool for the future of humanity is often seen as a critical failure. The Emperor, fixated on his vision of a rational and structured Imperium, could not see the future potential of psychic powers and, in doing so, shut off a path that Magnus was exploring. If the Emperor had embraced Magnus's view, could the catastrophic events of the heresy have been avoided? This leads to another question. Was the Emperor's refusal to accept Magnus's choices indicative of his rigidity, or was it a wise decision rooted in the need to keep humanity safe from the dangers of chaos? Then there's the issue of Magnus's responsibility for the rubric. Magnus's decision to perform the rubric, which resulted in the transformation of his legion into mindless automata, is seen as a tragic turning point. While his intentions were to preserve the lives of his warriors, the consequences were disastrous. Fans continue to argue whether Magnus's desperation to save his legion was justified or if it was an overreach. Was the rubric a necessary evil, a sacrifice to prevent the full corruption of his warriors? Alternatively, some question whether there were other ways to address the situation, particularly if Magnus had better control of his powers or had made different choices earlier. Did Magnus's emotional and mental state influence his decision-making? Could he have avoided the rubric entirely? These unanswered questions form one of the most contentious aspects of Magnus's character and actions. Additionally, the nature of Magnus's relationship with chaos remains a point of much speculation. While it's clear that Magnus fell under the sway of chaos, some theories suggest that his actions were influenced not by personal desire for power, but by a more complex set of factors. Was he coerced into his decisions by the manipulative forces of the warp, or was he truly willing to embrace chaos to achieve his vision for the future? Did the Chaos Gods play a direct role in pushing him down this path, or was his fall a matter of inevitable fate? Was it a product of Magnus's own ambition, or were there larger cosmic forces at play that ultimately led him to make the choices he did? Some argue that Magnus was merely a victim of the Chaos Gods' manipulations, while others contend that he embraced chaos because he believed it was the only way to save his people and the Imperium. The ambiguity surrounding his fall leaves fans divided over his true motivations. The idea of whether Magnus was a true rebel or simply a misunderstood figure is another subject of discussion. On one hand, His rebellion against the Emperor can be viewed as a catastrophic betrayal that led to the destruction of his legion and the fragmentation of the Imperium. On the other hand, some theorize that Magnus's actions, while extreme, were ultimately in line with his desire to protect humanity. His willingness to use forbidden knowledge and challenge the Emperor's authority might be seen as an attempt to prevent a greater disaster which the Emperor failed to see. Was Magnus's rebellion a result of his unwavering loyalty to humanity, or was it driven by personal ambition and a desire to prove his own worth? Some fans argue that Magnus was not acting out of defiance for the sake of it, but rather out of a deep conviction that the Emperor's vision was too narrow and doomed to fail. The question of how Magnus's actions were interpreted by others within the Imperium is also a complex issue. While some saw him as a hero trying to protect humanity from its greatest threats, others saw him as a dangerous figure who was willing to risk everything for the sake of his own ideals. The interpretation of his actions is still a matter of great debate, with some factions within the Imperium viewing him as a martyr, while others regard him as a traitor who doomed the galaxy. How did the others who shared his ideals, such as Lorgar, view him? Did they see Magnus as a fellow visionary who was simply misunderstood, or did they see him as an example of what happens when one falls too far into the grasp of the warp? Another fascinating theory surrounds the idea that Magnus was not acting alone in his decisions. Some theorists suggest that Magnus was guided or manipulated by a higher power, such as the entity known as the Great Deceiver. They propose that Magnus's choices were not entirely his own, and that he was part of a much larger and darker plan, with the Chaos Gods orchestrating events from behind the scenes. Others speculate that Magnus may have been a pawn in a much more intricate game involving not just the forces of chaos, but other more subtle cosmic entities. If this is true, it raises the question of whether Magnus could ever truly be blamed for his actions, or if he was merely a victim of forces beyond his control.